A badge is supposed to symbolize protection, but in the hands of the wrong person, it becomes a weapon of absolute humiliation. Picture a cold, fluorescent-lit precinct room where an arrogant police officer stands holding a pair of heavy steel shears, a cruel smirk plastered across his face. He thinks he is teaching a random, defenseless woman a lesson by forcibly shaving her cherished, meticulously maintained hair. He thinks he holds all the power in the room, shielded by the blue wall of silence. What he does not know, what will soon shatter his entire reality and career, is that the quiet woman staring blankly back at him is not a nobody. She is the honorable district judge about to preside over his impending federal corruption trial. An absolute hell is about to rain down. The rain was coming down in sheets across the windshield of the unassuming dark gray sedan late on a rainy night. Inside the car sat Elena Prescott. To anyone looking through the rain-streaked glass, she appeared to be just another exhausted middle-aged woman driving home from a late shift. She was dressed in an oversized gray college hoodie, faded black sweatpants, and sneakers. Her most striking feature was her hair, a magnificent crown of thick, carefully cultivated sister locks that cascaded past her shoulders, representing years of patience, heritage, and personal pride. What the casual observer would not know was that Elena Prescott was the Honorable Judge Elena Prescott of the 5th District Federal Court. She had spent the last hours in her chambers poring over mountains of discovery documents for a massive, high-profile civil rights and racketeering case involving a rogue narcotics unit in the city's police department. The case was a political powder keg. It involved allegations of officers planting evidence, conducting illegal searches, and terrorizing the citizens they were sworn to protect. Elena was known in the legal community as a brilliant, unshakable jurist, tough, deeply fair, and entirely immune to intimidation. But tonight, stripped of her black robe and the deference of the courtroom, she was just a tired driver navigating the slick asphalt of Route 9. 2 miles behind her, a squad car idled in the shadows of an underpass. Inside sat Officer Travis Caldwell and his rookie partner, Officer Riley Beckett. Caldwell was a veteran of the force, a man with a thick neck, a short temper, and a personnel file stuffed with use-of-force complaints that had conveniently been swept under the rug by his union buddies. Beckett, fresh out of the academy, was still idealistic but rapidly learning that in Caldwell's patrol car, you kept your mouth shut and followed the veteran's lead. "Look at this one," Caldwell muttered, tapping the steering wheel as Elena's gray sedan drove past at exactly the speed limit, driving a little too perfect. "She's doing the limit, Travis," Beckett pointed out, squinting through the wiper blades. "Exactly. Suspicious," Caldwell sneered, throwing the cruiser into gear and flipping on the sirens. The blinding red and blue lights fractured through the heavy rain. Elena sighed as the lights flooded her rearview mirror. She signaled, pulled smoothly over to the shoulder, turned off her engine, rolled down her window, and placed both hands firmly at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. It was standard protocol, something she taught her own nephews to do. Caldwell approached the driver's side, his heavy flashlight completely blinding her. He did not introduce himself. He did not state the reason for the stop. "License, registration, and proof of insurance, now!" Caldwell barked, his voice dripping with unwarranted aggression. "Good evening, officer," Elena said calmly, turning her head slightly away from the blinding beam. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" "I don't have to explain myself to you," Caldwell demanded, leaning closer, invading her space. The smell of wet wool and stale coffee wafted off his uniform. "Actually, officer, under the law, you do," Elena replied, her voice remaining perfectly level. "If you are detaining me, I have a right to know the articulable suspicion for the stop." Caldwell froze. The legal terminology irritated him. In his world, people did not quote the law. They cowed. "Oh, we got a roadside lawyer here," he mocked, looking back at Beckett, who was hovering nervously near the trunk. Listen to me very carefully. You are going to hand over your ID, or I am going to pull you out of this car and make you hand it over." Elena reached slowly toward her passenger seat to grab her purse. "I'm reaching for my bag," she narrated clearly. She retrieved her wallet, pulled out her driver's license, and handed it to him. Caldwell snatched it. In the pouring rain, he did not even bother to read the name. He just saw a middle-aged black woman in a hoodie who had the audacity to question his authority. To Caldwell, her calmness was a direct insult to his ego. "Step out of the vehicle," Caldwell ordered. "On what grounds?" Elena asked. "I have provided my identification. Have I committed a traffic violation?" "I said step out of the vehicle," Caldwell roared. Before Elena could unbuckle her seatbelt, Caldwell reached through the window, yanked the door open from the inside, and grabbed her left arm. He hauled her out into the freezing rain with such brutal force that her shoulder popped. He slammed her chest first against the side of her wet car. "Stop! What are you doing?" Elena yelled, the sudden violence shocking her. "Stop resisting. Beckett, she's resisting," Caldwell yelled, employing the classic tactic to justify his escalation. He kicked her legs apart and violently wrenched her arms behind her back, the metal handcuffs biting deeply into her wrists. "I'm not resisting," Elena stated, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the sharp pain radiating down her arm. "You are conducting an unlawful arrest. I want your badge number." "You want my badge number?" Caldwell laughed, a dark, ugly sound over the pouring rain. "You're going to get a lot more than that, sweetheart. You're going to jail for assaulting a police officer." Beckett stepped forward, his face pale under the streetlights. "Travis, she didn't assault you. She didn't do anything." "Shut up, Riley. She grabbed my arm," Caldwell lied effortlessly. He shoved Elena toward the back of the cruiser. "Watch your head," he sneered before aggressively pushing her down into the hard plastic seat of the patrol car. As the door slammed shut, leaving her in the dark, damp, claustrophobic back seat, Elena Prescott took a deep breath. She did not panic. She did not scream. Her mind, honed by decades of legal warfare, immediately shifted gears. She began mentally cataloging every single detail: the lack of a stated violation, the excessive force, the perjury Caldwell had just committed in front of his partner. She was not just a victim in the back of a police car. She was a judge collecting evidence. The ride to the 4th Precinct was suffocatingly tense. Caldwell drove erratically, taking sharp turns to deliberately toss Elena around in the back seat, knowing she had no way to brace herself with her hands cuffed behind her back. Elena remained dead silent. She refused to give him the satisfaction of a groan or a complaint. When they arrived at the precinct, the holding area was a chaotic, foul-smelling room, filled with the usual Friday night crowd: intoxicated drivers, petty thieves, and belligerent brawlers. At the booking desk sat Sergeant Grady Ellis, an older cop who was counting down the days to his pension and had long ago stopped caring about the conduct of the officers under his watch. Caldwell hauled Elena in by her bicep, pushing her roughly toward the desk. "What do we have, Travis?" Ellis asked without looking up from his computer screen. "Assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, obstruction of justice," Caldwell rattled off casually, dropping Elena's wallet into a clear plastic property bag. Again, he did not even bother to look at the name on the ID. If he had, he might have noticed the address was in one of the most affluent, secure neighborhoods in the state. He might have recognized the name that was plastered on the federal courthouse directory downtown. But hubris is a blinding disease. "Take her to holding cell 3, Ellis grunted, tossing Caldwell a set of keys. "We'll process her when the system comes back online. It's doing an update." "I am entitled to my phone call," Elena said clearly, her voice cutting through the dull roar of the precinct. Caldwell spun around, stepping into her personal space. "You get a phone call when I say you get a phone call. Right now you're a threat to officer safety. Turn around." He uncuffed her only to push her into the concrete-walled holding cell, slamming the heavy iron bars shut behind her. The cell was freezing, smelling faintly of bleach and urine. Elena sat on the cold steel bench, rubbing her bruised wrists. She looked up and noticed a black, dome-shaped security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. A tiny red light blinked. It was recording. Good, she thought. Keep recording. An hour passed, then 2. The precinct quieted down. Hours later, the heavy metal door to the cell block swung open. Caldwell walked down the corridor, holding something metallic in his right hand. He was accompanied by Beckett, who looked physically ill. Caldwell stopped in front of Elena's cell. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. In his hand was a pair of heavy-duty industrial scissors, the kind kept in the first aid kits to cut through thick clothing. "Stand up," Caldwell commanded. Elena stood slowly. "What is this?" "Standard precinct health and safety protocol," Caldwell lied smoothly, a sadistic gleam in his eye. "You engaged in a physical altercation with an officer. You've got all that hair. It's a biohazard. Lice protocol. We have to cut it off." Beckett stepped into the doorway, his voice trembling. "Travis, you can't do this. That protocol is only for documented infestations, and we have no proof." "I said wait outside, Beckett," Caldwell snapped, turning his massive frame toward the rookie. "This suspect is uncooperative and a hygiene risk. I'm following department policy." It was a blatant, monstrous lie. Elena knew the department policy inside and out. She had literally ruled on a civil suit regarding precinct holding policies years prior. This was not about lice. This was not about safety. This was about power. It was about a fragile, angry man needing to physically strip a black woman of her pride and identity because she had not bowed down to him on the side of the highway. Elena looked at the heavy shears, and for the first time that night, a spike of genuine, crushing terror hit her chest. Her locks were an extension of her identity. They held her history, her culture, her journey. "Officer Caldwell," Elena said, reading his name tag. "If you touch me with those shears, you will face consequences that you cannot even begin to comprehend. This is a violation of my 4th and 8th Amendment rights, and it is a felony battery. Think very carefully about your next move." Her articulate, authoritative warning only threw gasoline on his ego. "Are you threatening me in my own jail?" Caldwell hissed. He lunged forward, grabbing a thick handful of her locks near the root. The pulling pain brought tears to Elena's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She locked her jaw. Snip. Crunch. The thick sound of the steel cutting through her hair echoed in the small cell. A long, beautiful lock fell to the dirty concrete floor. Beckett turned his back, putting his hands over his faumpouis, unable to watch, but too terrified of his senior officer to stop it. Caldwell kept going. He hacked away brutally, unevenly, pulling and tearing when the scissors could not cut through the thick mat of hair. He was not just cutting her hair. He was trying to cut away her dignity. Chunk after chunk of her hair fell around her feet, piling up on the floor like discarded autumn leaves. Through the entire agonizing ordeal, Elena Prescott did not scream. She did not beg. She stared straight over Caldwell's shoulder, locking her eyes directly onto the blinking red light of the security camera in the corner. She memorized the smell of his breath. She memorized the exact sound of his voice. She memorized the pathetic, cowardly silence of Officer Beckett. When Caldwell was finally done, Elena's head was a jagged, uneven mess of shorn roots and patches of scalp. She looked radically different, stripped, battered, violated. Caldwell took a step back, breathing heavily, admiring his cruel handiwork. He kicked a pile of her severed locks with the toe of his boot. "There. Now you look like a proper inmate. Maybe next time you'll show a little respect to the badge." He turned and walked out, slamming the cell door shut and locking it. Elena stood perfectly still in the center of the cell. She slowly reached up, her trembling fingers touching the jagged ruins of her hair. A single tear escaped, rolling down her cheek. But it was not a tear of defeat. It was a tear of absolute, crystalline rage. She sat back down on the steel bench, straight-backed, her hands folded in her lap. In the days ahead, she would be sitting high on the bench in the courtroom. And the name of the lead officer scheduled to testify in the federal corruption hearing she was presiding over was Officer Travis Caldwell. He has no idea, she thought, her eyes cold as ice. He has absolutely no idea. The automated fingerprint identification system at the 4th Precinct finally flickered back to life the next morning. Sergeant Grady Ellis, blurry-eyed and sipping his 4th cup of stale coffee, fed Elena's prints into the scanner to finalize the booking process. Seconds later, the screen did not just populate a standard civilian profile. It flashed a bright red restricted federal classification banner. Ellis's heavy brow furrowed. He leaned in, adjusting his glasses. The text on the screen was unequivocal. Name, Elena Prescott. Status, Federal Judge, 5th District Court of Appeals. Flags, high-level security clearance. Do not detain without federal authorization. Ellis stopped breathing. The styrofoam cup slipped from his trembling hand, coffee splashing across his desk and onto the floor. He stared at the name, then stared at the holding cell manifest. Officer Travis Caldwell had booked a sitting federal judge on bogus assault charges and tossed her into cell 3 like a common vagrant. "Oh, God," Ellis whispered, his stomach dropping into his shoes. "Oh, my dear God." But before Ellis could even attempt to unring the bell, the heavy double doors of the precinct flew open. Striding through them was Quentin Sterling. Quentin was not just Elena's husband of years. He was a founding partner at one of the city's most ruthless and successful civil rights litigation firms. Behind him stood 2 men in sharp, dark suits. Special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Public Corruption Unit. Elena had used her one phone call early that morning not to cry, but to issue a set of incredibly precise, devastating legal instructions to her husband. Quentin did not yell. He did not make a scene. He simply walked up to the booking desk, slid his bar card and a federal release order across the counter, and locked eyes with Sergeant Ellis. "You have my wife in holding cell 3, Quentin said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "You are going to release her to me immediately. Furthermore, Agent Brooks here is serving you with a federal preservation warrant. If a single second of security footage from this precinct from the hours of the stop onward goes missing, is corrupted, or is altered in any way, you will personally be indicted for obstruction of justice. Do we understand each other?" Ellis was pale as a ghost. He nodded frantically, grabbing the keys. When they brought Elena out, Quentin's breath caught in his throat. He saw the bruised wrists. He saw the dirty, damp clothes. And then he saw her hair. The beautiful, thick locks she had maintained since law school were gone, replaced by a brutal, jagged, patchy ruin that exposed her scalp. The sheer violence of the haircut told a story of utter humiliation. Quentin stepped forward, taking off his expensive wool coat and wrapping it gently around her shoulders. He looked at her head, his eyes welling with tears of rage. "Elena, don't," Elena said softly, her voice like steel. She looked past her husband to Agent Brooks. "Did you secure the server?" "We have physical possession of the precinct's hard drives, Your Honor," Brooks replied, looking at the floor, visibly sickened by what had been done to her. "Nobody can touch the tape." "Good," Elena said, pulling the coat tighter around herself. "Let's go home. I have court soon." Over the following days, a silent, invisible storm gathered. Caldwell spent his time off drinking at a local cop bar, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire life was already over. He bragged to his buddies about putting a loudmouth in her place, completely unaware that the FBI was currently watching high-definition footage of him committing a federal civil rights violation and felony battery. They also secured the dashboard camera from his cruiser, which clearly showed Elena's perfect driving and his completely unprovoked, violent extraction of her from the vehicle. Then came the morning of the hearing. The federal courthouse downtown was a towering monument to justice, constructed of white marble and polished oak. In courtroom 302, the air was thick with anticipation. Today was the preliminary evidentiary hearing for the city's largest police corruption trial in a decade. The gallery was packed with reporters, city officials, and police union representatives. Sitting at the witness table, looking smug in his pressed dress uniform, was Officer Travis Caldwell. Beside him was Garrett Riley, the high-priced union defense attorney. Caldwell leaned back in his leather chair, chewing a piece of gum, exuding the arrogant confidence of a man who believed the system was built to protect him. Across the aisle sat federal prosecutor Damian Reed, who was uncharacteristically quiet, arranging his files with a tense, almost vibrating energy. At the start of the session, the heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed, echoing off the high ceilings. "The Honorable United States District Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Elena Prescott presiding. God save the United States and this honorable court." Caldwell stood lazily, buttoning his uniform jacket, his eyes wandering up to the bench. Judge Elena Prescott emerged. She was wearing her flowing black judicial robe, the ultimate symbol of legal authority, but she had made a very deliberate choice this morning. She wore no wig. She wore no head wrap. She walked up the steps and took her seat high above the courtroom, exposing the jagged, violently shorn remnants of her hair to the harsh, fluorescent lights of the courtroom. The raw patches of scalp and the violently cut roots were jarring, a stark, visceral contrast to the immaculate dignity of her robe. A heavy, confused murmur rippled through the gallery. Reporters whispered. The union reps frowned. Caldwell looked up, his eyes locked onto the woman sitting behind the massive mahogany bench. First he saw the face, the calm, unblinking, stoic face of the woman he had dragged out of a car on Route 9. Then he saw the hair, the unmistakable butchered handiwork of the steel shears he had wielded in holding cell 3 just days ago. The piece of gum fell out of Caldwell's open mouth and landed on the polished table. Every single drop of blood drained from his face, leaving him the color of old parchment. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to grip the edge of the heavy oak table to stop himself from collapsing. A cold, suffocating terror gripped his chest, squeezing his lungs until he could not pull in a breath. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. "It's her!" his brain screamed. The realization hitting him with the force of a freight train. The nobody in the sweatpants, the woman I assaulted, the woman I shaved. It's the federal judge holding my entire future in her hands. Elena arranged her files on the bench. She looked down, her eyes finding Caldwell in the crowd. She did not glare. She did not sneer. She simply looked at him with the cold, absolute detachment of a predator watching its prey step into an inescapable trap. "Be seated," Judge Prescott commanded. Her voice, the exact same, even measured voice that had warned him in the precinct cell, echoed through the silent courtroom. Caldwell fell into his chair, his hands shaking so violently they rattled against the wood. The trap was set, and the gavel was about to drop. Garrett Riley, the union attorney, immediately noticed his client's catastrophic physical reaction. Travis, what's wrong with you?" "You look like you're having a heart attack," Riley whispered harshly, leaning over. Caldwell could not speak. He could only stare, wide-eyed and paralyzed, at the woman on the bench. His mind was frantically trying to build a defense, an escape route, a lie, anything. But there was nothing. He had handcuffed her. He had assaulted her. He had mutilated her hair on camera. Before we begin today's scheduled proceedings regarding the federal corruption indictments, Judge Prescott began, her voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room, I must address a procedural matter of the utmost gravity, a matter that requires me to formally enter a statement into the federal record. Prosecutor Damian Reed stood up. The government is ready to hear your statement, Your Honor. Elena looked directly at the defense table. Mr. Riley, does your client, Officer Travis Caldwell, understand the penalties for perjury and the violation of civil rights under color of law? Riley stood, deeply confused by the sudden deviation. Yes, Your Honor. My client is a veteran officer. He understands the law. I see, Elena said smoothly. Let the record reflect that Officer Caldwell is currently scheduled to testify in this court as a key witness regarding the ethical and legal conduct of the city's police force. She paused, letting the irony hang in the air. However, I find myself in an unprecedented ethical dilemma. Under the Judicial Code of Conduct, a judge must recuse herself from any proceeding in which her impartiality might reasonably be questioned. Particularly, a judge must recuse herself if she has personal knowledge of disputed evidentiary facts, or if she is the direct victim of a violent felony committed by the defendant standing before her. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the courtroom. Reporters leaned forward, pens hovering furiously over their notepads. Riley's jaw dropped. Your Honor, I don't understand, Riley stammered. Let me clarify it for you, Counselor, Elena said, leaning forward, her eyes never leaving Caldwell. That night on Route 9, I was pulled over. I was dragged from my vehicle without cause. I was physically assaulted, sustaining a dislocated shoulder and severe lacerations to my wrists. I was then transported to the 4th Precinct where I was unlawfully detained in a holding cell. She raised her hand, gently touching the jagged, ruined ends of her hair. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. And while in that cell, the arresting officer, acting out of pure malice, racial animus, and an unchecked abuse of power, forcibly held me down and used industrial shears to cut off my hair, falsely citing a lice protocol to his protesting rookie partner. Pandemonium threatened to break out in the gallery. The union representatives looked like they had been struck by lightning. Officer Travis Caldwell, Judge Prescott said, her voice rising just a fraction, booming with authoritative power. Stand up. Caldwell could not move. His legs refused to work. Riley, now sweating profusely and realizing the nuclear bomb his client had detonated, grabbed Caldwell by the arm and yanked him to his feet. Did you or did you not pull me over that night, Officer Caldwell? Elena demanded. Caldwell choked, his throat completely dry. The arrogant, untouchable cop was gone, replaced by a trembling, broken shell of a man. Your Honor, I didn't know who you were. If you had known I was a federal judge, you would have treated me with respect, Elena interjected, her tone laced with absolute disgust. That is the exact crux of the corruption we are here to try. You believe that basic human dignity and constitutional rights are only afforded to those with titles, power, or a badge. You believed I was a nobody. You believed you could terrorize me in the dark, and the system would blindly protect you. Elena looked past Caldwell to the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. She gave a slight nod. The doors swung open. Agent Brooks and 4 other heavily armed FBI agents in tactical vests walked down the center aisle. You relied on the blue wall of silence, Officer Caldwell, Elena continued as the agents approached the defense table. But you see, cowardice is a fragile thing. When faced with federal prison time for complicity in a civil rights violation, your rookie partner, Officer Riley Beckett, made a choice. Caldwell's head snapped around. Officer Beckett walked into the FBI field office the day before, Elena revealed, delivering the final fatal blow. He surrendered his badge. He provided a full recorded confession of your actions, and he handed over the physical shears you used, complete with my DNA and your fingerprints. We also have the precinct video and the dashboard camera footage. Riley physically backed away from Caldwell, raising his hands. Your Honor, I am withdrawing as counsel. I was not informed of any of this by my client. He practically sprinted away from the table, leaving Caldwell entirely alone. Officer Travis Caldwell, Judge Prescott said, picking up her heavy wooden gavel. I'm formally recusing myself from your corruption trial, as I am now the chief complaining witness in the federal criminal case against you. You are hereby remanded into the custody of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Agent Brooks stepped forward, grabbing Caldwell's arms and wrenching them behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the heavy federal handcuffs echoed loudly in the stunned courtroom. It was the exact same sound Elena had heard in the freezing rain on Route 9. You have the right to remain silent, Agent Brooks whispered into Caldwell's ear, his voice dripping with contempt. Though considering what you've done, I doubt anyone is ever going to listen to you again. Take him out of my courtroom, Elena ordered, as the FBI dragged a weeping, hyperventilating Travis Caldwell down the center aisle, past the flashing cameras of the press and the horrified faces of his former union brothers. Elena Prescott sat tall. She did not try to hide her butchered hair. She wore it as a badge of honor, a brutal but triumphant testament to the fact that justice, when wielded correctly, is the great equalizer. She banged her gavel, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot. Court is in recess. By that afternoon, the footage of Officer Travis Caldwell being perp-walked out of Judge Elena Prescott's courtroom in federal handcuffs was playing on every major news network across the country. The story was a media juggernaut. It had everything: race, abuse of power, stunning hubris, and an absolutely biblical dose of instant karma. The image of Judge Prescott sitting on the bench with her violently butchered hair juxtaposed against the terrified, pale face of the man who had done it became an instant cultural touchstone. For Caldwell, the descent into hell was remarkably swift. The vaunted blue wall of silence, the unspoken fraternity that had protected him through years of excessive force complaints, brutal arrests, and blatant perjury, evaporated in hours. That afternoon, Chief of Police Warren Doyle held a live press conference on the steps of City Hall. Sweating profusely under the glare of dozens of camera lights, Doyle looked like a man trying to outrun an avalanche. The actions of Travis Caldwell do not reflect the values of this department, Chief Doyle declared to a sea of hostile reporters. Effective immediately, Caldwell has been terminated without pension. We are fully cooperating with the FBI and the Department of Justice. There is no place for this kind of monstrous behavior in uniform. The local police union, usually rabid in their defense of any officer accused of misconduct, issued a terse 4-sentence statement condemning the act and announcing they would not be funding Caldwell's legal defense. He was completely, utterly on his own. That night, Caldwell found himself processed into the Metropolitan Correctional Center, a grim federal holding facility reserved for high-risk and high-profile inmates. The irony was suffocating. He was stripped of his clothes, sprayed with a harsh delousing chemical, and handed a scratchy, oversized orange jumpsuit. When the heavy steel door of his solitary confinement cell slammed shut, the sound echoed in his chest. It was the exact same sound he had subjected Elena to that night. But Elena had known she was leaving. Caldwell knew he was never getting out. The psychological toll of the fishbowl began immediately. As a former cop, Caldwell was a massive target. He was placed in administrative segregation, locked in a concrete box the size of a parking space. For a man whose entire identity was built on physical intimidation and commanding others, the absolute loss of autonomy was crushing. He had no union rep to call. His ex-wife would not accept his collect calls. His friends on the force had blocked his number. He was assigned a notoriously overworked public defender named Nolan Kessler, a man who looked at Caldwell with the exact same thinly veiled disgust that the rest of the world felt. They're charging you with deprivation of rights under color of law, aggravated assault, and obstruction of justice, Kessler explained during their first incredibly tense meeting in a bleak visitation room. Because the victim is a federal judge, and because you used a weapon, the heavy shears, during the commission of the civil rights violation, the sentencing guidelines are astronomical. The lead prosecutor is Sarah Harrington. She's a bulldog, Travis. She doesn't lose, and she certainly doesn't offer plea deals to rogue cops. Caldwell rubbed his face, his hands trembling. He had aged years and days. There has to be a way out. I thought she was just some woman. I thought she was a suspect. That is exactly why you are going to lose, Kessler replied bluntly, snapping his briefcase shut. Your defense is that you only abuse regular citizens. You're going to federal prison, Travis. The only question is whether it's for years or the rest of your natural life. Over the following months, Caldwell rotted in his cell while the prosecution built an impenetrable fortress of a case. Every single one of his past arrests was pulled and scrutinized. The city, desperate to avoid the impending multi-million-dollar civil rights lawsuit Quentin Sterling was preparing to drop on them, handed over every shred of Caldwell's internal affairs file. But the most devastating piece of the puzzle remained the testimony of Officer Riley Beckett. Beckett had traded his badge for immunity, but the guilt of his inaction that night haunted him. He spent countless hours with prosecutor Sarah Harrington, outlining not just the night of the arrest, but the culture of casual cruelty that Caldwell had tried to indoctrinate him into. By the time the trial date arrived, Travis Caldwell was a hollowed-out shell. The thick neck and aggressive swagger were gone, replaced by the slumped, terrified posture of a man who finally understood that he was not the predator he believed himself to be. He was just a bully who had picked the wrong victim. The federal courthouse was barricaded. Protesters lined the streets, holding up signs demanding justice for Judge Prescott and an end to police brutality. Inside courtroom 114, presided over by the stern, no-nonsense Honorable Judge Marcus Harrington, the atmosphere was electric. Bradley Caldwell sat at the defense table. He wore an ill-fitting gray suit provided by the public defender's office. He stared at his hands, unable to look at the gallery, which was packed to capacity. Prosecutor Sarah Harrington's opening statement was a masterclass in controlled fury. She did not just paint Caldwell as a bad cop. She dissected his psychology, presenting him as a man who used a state-issued badge to mask a deep-seated violent cowardice. She promised the jury that they would see and hear exactly what unchecked power looked like in the dark. The first days of the trial were a systematic dismantling of Caldwell's life. Riley Beckett took the stand. The young former officer wept openly as he recounted the events of Route 9. She wasn't resisting, Beckett testified, wiping his eyes, refusing to look at his former mentor. She was perfectly calm. She asked for his articulable suspicion, and it made him furious. He hated that she knew her rights. He hated that she wasn't afraid of him. Harrington pressed further. "And what happened in the holding cell, Mr. Beckett?" "He told me to wait outside," Beckett choked out. "He grabbed those heavy trauma shears. He said he was going to teach her a lesson about respect. He lied about a lice protocol. He hacked at her hair. She never screamed. She just looked at the camera. It was the most awful thing I've ever seen." But the true turning point of the trial came when the prosecution called their final witness. "The government calls the Honorable Judge Elena Prescott," Harrington announced. The heavy oak doors opened. Elena walked down the center aisle. She wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit. Her hair, which had been jagged and ruined months earlier, was now styled into a sharp, elegant, close-cropped natural fade. She looked powerful, dignified, and entirely unbothered by the gravity of the room. She was a woman who lived and breathed the law. She took the stand, placing her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Caldwell shrank into his chair. He felt physically sick. Harrington approached the podium. Judge Prescott, could you please take the jury through the events of that night? For the next hours, Elena Prescott delivered a testimony so precise, so clinically devastating that the defense table practically ceased to exist. She did not rely on emotion. She relied on facts. She broke down the traffic stop using exact legal terminology, highlighting every constitutional violation Caldwell had committed. She detailed the false arrest, the excessive force, and the physical injuries she sustained. And when you arrived at the 4th precinct, Harrington asked, did the defendant read you your Miranda rights? He did not, Elena answered, her voice ringing clear and steady across the silent courtroom. He proceeded to mock my request for legal counsel and unlawfully detained me in a holding cell without officially processing my charges. Let's talk about the holding cell, Your Honor, Harrington said gently. What happened hours later? Officer Caldwell entered my cell with a pair of industrial trauma shears, Elena stated, her eyes locking onto Caldwell for the first time. He flinched visibly. He informed me that my hair was a biohazard and that he was enacting a health and safety protocol. Was there such a protocol? No. I authored the appellate decision striking down arbitrary precinct hygiene modifications years prior, Elena noted dryly. It was a transparent fabrication designed to justify a physical battery. Harrington then introduced Exhibit C, the precinct surveillance video. The lights in the courtroom dimmed. On the large monitors facing the jury, the grainy black and white footage began to play. The courtroom watched in horrifying silence as the massive uniformed Caldwell lunged at the seated woman. They watched him grab her by the roots of her hair. The audio kicked in, a terrible wet crunching sound of the heavy steel shears hacking through thick hair. They watched Elena sit perfectly still, enduring the mutilation with a terrifying stoic grace, staring directly into the camera lens. Several jurors put their hands over their mouths. One juror, an older woman, began to quietly cry. When the video ended and the lights came back up, the silence in the courtroom was heavier than lead. Harrington looked at the jury, then back to Elena. Judge Prescott, why didn't you scream? Why didn't you tell him who you were? Elena leaned forward, her gaze sweeping across the jury box. Because if I had told him I was a federal judge, he would have stopped. He would have apologized, uncuffed me, and let me go. And the next night, he would have pulled over a young college student or a single mother or someone who didn't have the power to fight back. I didn't scream because I needed him to finish committing his crime on camera. I needed to ensure he could never ever do it to anyone else. A chill ran through the room. It was the ultimate checkmate. Nolan Kessler, the public defender, stood up for cross-examination, knowing it was a suicide mission. Judge Prescott, Kessler began nervously. Is it possible that Officer Caldwell genuinely believed you were a suspect fleeing a crime? Elena looked at Kessler with a mixture of pity and steel. Mr. Kessler, as an attorney, you know that genuine belief requires articulable facts. I was driving the speed limit. I complied with all lawful orders. The only fact your client relied upon was his own prejudice and his desire to inflict humiliation. You cannot litigate away malice. Kessler swallowed hard. No further questions, Your Honor. Caldwell buried his face in his hands. The trial was effectively over. The jury deliberations in the case of the United States versus Travis Caldwell did not take long. Shortly after the bailiff escorted the 12 men and women into the deliberation room, the buzzer sounded. They had reached a verdict. When the news filtered out to the crowded hallways of the federal courthouse, a palpable jolt of electricity surged through the crowd. Reporters scrambled for their seats. Cameras flashed outside the heavy oak doors, and the gallery filled to absolute capacity. At the prosecution table, Sarah Harrington sat perfectly still, organizing her files with the quiet confidence of a lawyer who knew she had delivered a fatal strike. Across the aisle, Travis Caldwell looked like a man walking to his own execution. His skin was sallow, his eyes bloodshot from endless sleepless nights in his solitary cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. His public defender, Nolan Kessler, placed a sympathetic but utterly defeated hand on his client's shoulder. There were no miracles left to pull from the ether. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed as the Honorable Judge Marcus Harrington took the bench. Judge Harrington, a notoriously strict jurist with zero tolerance for corruption, looked over his reading glasses at the jury box. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The jury foreman, a stoic retired high school principal named William Hatcher, stood up. He held a single sheet of paper. "We have, Your Honor." "The defendant will rise," Judge Harrington ordered. Caldwell stood, his knees trembling so violently that Kessler had to subtly grip his elbow to keep him upright. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of an impending avalanche. "On the first count of the indictment, deprivation of rights under color of law, how do you find?" "We find the defendant guilty," Foreman Hatcher answered clearly. Caldwell let out a ragged, pathetic gasp, closing his eyes. "On the second count, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, guilty. On the third count, obstruction of justice and official misconduct, guilty." The word echoed like a hammer striking an anvil. Caldwell collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving with uncontrollable sobs. The arrogant, untouchable cop who had terrorized the citizens of his city for years was entirely broken. He was no longer a predator. He was just another convicted felon waiting to be processed into the federal prison system. But the true devastation arrived weeks later during the sentencing hearing. Elena Prescott chose not to attend. She had already spoken her truth, and she had a docket of her own cases to manage. But her husband, Quentin Sterling, sat in the front row, his eyes locked onto the man who had assaulted his wife. Judge Harrington did not mince his words. He looked down at Caldwell with a gaze that could freeze boiling water. "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Harrington began, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "In my years on the bench, I have rarely seen an abuse of power so brazen, so cruel, and so deeply steeped in malice. You were given a badge and a gun to protect the vulnerable. Instead, you used them as a shield to enact your own twisted, violent prejudices. You looked at a woman on a dark highway and saw someone you believed you could humiliate without consequence. You tore away her dignity, and in doing so, you tore at the very fabric of the public trust." Harrison paused, looking down at his sentencing sheet. "The fact that your victim happened to be a sitting federal judge is merely the cosmic irony that brought you to this courtroom. Had she been anyone else, you might still be wearing that uniform, terrorizing the public. And that is a reality this court cannot and will not tolerate." Harrison raised his gavel. "Travis Caldwell, I hereby sentence you to serve a term of 18 years in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons to be served at the United States Penitentiary, Marion. You will not be eligible for early release. You will serve every single day of that sentence. Remand the prisoner." As the federal marshals pulled Caldwell to his feet and led him away, he did not look at the gallery. He did not look at Quentin Sterling. He simply stared at the floor, a ghost of a man stepping into a cage of his own making. But the karma did not stop at the courtroom doors. While Caldwell was being transported to a maximum security cell, Quentin Sterling unleashed the full terrifying might of his civil rights law firm. He filed a massive, multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the city, the police department, and the police union for a systemic failure to monitor, discipline, and terminate officers with established patterns of abuse. City Hall panicked. Mayor Victor Kane, facing a catastrophic public relations nightmare and an indefensible legal battle, immediately sought a settlement. After months of negotiations, the city capitulated. They agreed to a $25 million settlement, the largest of its kind in the state's history. But Elena and Quentin did not keep a single dime for themselves. Instead, they established the Route 9 Justice Initiative. The foundation was fiercely dedicated to providing top-tier aggressive legal representation for marginalized individuals who had been victims of police brutality. They funded independent civilian oversight boards, installed advanced auditing software to track precinct holding cell footage, and lobbied successfully for the Prescott Act, a sweeping state law that mandated immediate, unalterable cloud backups for all police body cameras and holding cell feeds, making it legally impossible for a rogue cop to ever turn off a camera or claim a glitch. Furthermore, the 4th Precinct was completely overhauled. Sergeant Grady Ellis was forced into early retirement without his full pension for his negligence, and the entire night shift was disbanded and retrained under strict federal oversight. Officer Riley Beckett, having turned state's evidence, left law enforcement entirely, choosing instead to become an investigator for the very foundation Elena and Quentin had built, dedicating his life to making amends for his silence. Months later, the federal courthouse was bustling as usual. In courtroom 302, the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Elena Prescott presiding." Elena stepped up to the bench. She looked radiant. Her hair, once a jagged ruin, had grown out into a beautiful thick halo of natural curls. She adjusted her reading glasses, opened her first case file, and looked out over the lawyers assembled before her. She had survived the ultimate betrayal of authority, not by sinking to the level of her abuser, but by using the unyielding power of the law to crush him. She was a living, breathing testament to the fact that absolute arrogance is a glass house, and truth is the stone that shatters it. She picked up her gavel and let it fall. Court is in session. The story of Judge Elena Prescott and Officer Travis Caldwell is a powerful reminder that arrogance and unchecked authority eventually meet their match. Caldwell believed his badge made him a god in the dark, entirely untouchable by the consequences of his own cruelty. But he learned the hardest way possible that true power does not lie in intimidation or physical force. It lies in composure, intelligence, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. Elena did not just survive his abuse. She dismantled his entire life and rebuilt the system to protect others from enduring the same nightmare. Karma did not just knock on Caldwell's door. It kicked it down and handed him an 18-year sentence. Sometimes life places us in moments of deep unfairness, where silence feels heavy, dignity is wounded, and pain seems impossible to overcome. Yet the most valuable lesson we can learn is that true strength is not always loud. It is found in the courage to stay calm when others try to break us, and the wisdom to let truth speak louder than anger, and in the faith that justice may be delayed, but it is never lost forever. Elena's story reminds us that no act of cruelty, no abuse of power, and no humiliation can destroy a person whose spirit refuses to surrender. What made her powerful was not revenge, but her ability to turn suffering into purpose, pain into evidence, and injustice into change that would protect others. In real life, many of us face betrayal, disrespect, or seasons where we feel unseen and powerless. But this story teaches us that your hardest moment does not define your end. It can become the very reason you rise, heal, and inspire others. Never let someone else's darkness convince you that your light is gone. Hold on to your dignity, hold on to your truth, and most of all, hold on long enough to see that character, patience, and courage will always outlast arrogance and evil. If this message touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments and tell us, have you ever turned pain into strength? And do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful life lessons and emotional stories that stay with you long after they end.